Hi, everybody, and welcome to another lecture for Poly 130. This is going to be a lecture following up on the week 9 that we had a long time ago before spring break. I had you do some readings on how we might devise electoral institutions for divided societies. And so I'm going to give you that lecture right now. Note that this is my third time recording this lecture, so hopefully it turns out this time. Some of the stuff has already kind of been alluded to, so I'm sorry if you didn't understand then, but hopefully this will fill in those blanks. So really quickly before we get there, some housekeeping. So your midterm grades were returned to you. Everybody should have their midterm grade. If you didn't take your midterm, you need to contact someone immediately so we can figure out how we're going to adjust for that, especially in this new virtual format. But everyone else should have their midterm grades delivered back to them. If you don't have your midterm grade, please let either me or your TA know as soon as possible. The other thing is obviously that we've shifted to remote instruction. You know that if you're watching this lecture. But really quickly, I want to give you a sense of what the resources are for that are available to you as we make this transition into remote instruction. So I've already sent you guys an online guide as to how you are supposed to, how we're going to transition the course. And that was made available via an announcement on Sakai, but there is a permanent link to the online guide in the helpful resources tab on Sakai, and I would definitely encourage you to at least download that, and if not, read the whole thing now. Keep it as a reference guide for you for any questions that you might have. We try to be very thorough in covering questions about what assessments would look like, what assignment due dates are, where lectures will be, what office hours will look like. So all of that is available on that online guide, and it's all arranged by page number. So you can quickly just refer to the information that you need by seeking out the page number, jotting it down, and then you don't technically have to read the whole document, although it was carefully crafted by yours truly. So I definitely encourage you to read it. Just so you know, the remote lectures that we will be doing are going to be made available on Sakai when possible, but since these are very big files, they're mostly going to be on the course YouTube. There's the link to the YouTube right there. And I would really encourage you to not only go to the page periodically, but definitely to subscribe so that you get all of the updates. I will not be posting on this YouTube page after remote instruction ends, so you don't have to worry if you're a subscriber. You're not going to get any new content after you have left this class. So definitely check that out as a way to watch the lectures for this class and keep up with class material. And then finally, I have created a course Slack in which you can follow the conversation about any of the topics for the week, ask questions, chat with either me or your TAs. And the Slack page, I guess, website portals are poly130.slack.com if you're in the big 240 person lecture, or poly130h.slack.com if you're in the honors version of the course. So definitely go there, check it out, and you can have all sorts of conversation. You can kind of, one of the things that we can't do as easily remotely is sometimes people will come up to me after a lecture and ask questions, but you can do that via the Slack platform in real time, and I check it quite often. So happy to answer any questions you might have. Okay, so quickly, because it has been so long since we've seen each other, I'm going to recap for you the things that we last talked about when we were studying institutions. So we talked about a lot of different institutions that are commonly found in democracies. We discussed executive legislative systems. So do you have a presidential system where your head of state is a president, or do you have a parliamentary system? We talked about electoral systems. So are we applying first past the post majoritarian rules, or are we doing more proportional representation? And we also talked about party systems, whether your parties were institutionalized or whether they were inchoate, whether they were strong or whether they were weak. Um, and the big question that we tried to answer when we were talking about electoral systems was whether there were certain types of electoral systems that were better at ensuring democratic stability than others, and representation within democratic systems rather than others. And we compared several different types of majoritarian systems, one to each other, but also to proportional representation systems. And in the aggregate, what we ended up finding um, is that um, majoritarian systems had the advantages of being fairly easy to understand, right? The rules are pretty simple. All you have to do is get one vote past the post. So in some cases, that's 50% of the vote plus one. In some cases, it's a plurality, right? So maybe 33% if there are three parties, et cetera, et cetera. So it's pretty easy for voters to understand that they're only voting for one candidate. It's pretty easy to translate those votes into offices. It incentivizes accountability between representatives and voters. So if you know that you're the only representative in a district, then voters know that you're the person to blame if things go wrong, right? So you have a kind of incentive to make sure that you are representing your voters' interests, that you are making effective policy, because you know that they will be able to assign blame very easily, and that they will probably vote you out of office if you don't enact policies that are in line with their preferences. But the disadvantages, particularly for stability and representation, is that on the one hand, for voters, it encourages strategic voting. And we saw um, when we looked at the political spectrum last class that if your preferences are very far to the left or right, right, so you're not somewhere in the middle, um, your party very likely is not going to have a good chance to win in a majoritarian election. And so you might have to not vote for your most preferred candidate and instead vote for someone closer to the middle. So you're not being effectively represented, and so you get these highly unrepresentative outcomes, right? Where there may be citizens that are at on the edges of the political spectrum. Parties tend to line up towards the middle. Candidates tend to line up towards the middle. And so people that are outside of that kind of middle range are not going to have someone that effectively represents their policy preferences. And we can kind of see that with a lot of young voters, a lot of voters of color, or at least young voters of color, in this primary election, right? A lot of people think that Joe Biden is a very moderate candidate, and a lot of Bernie supporters are very upset that kind of the centripetal forces of our party system, our majoritarian party system, is moving the vote towards a moderate candidate like Joe Biden, even though they prefer a more leftist candidate a la Bernie Sanders. But then we looked at proportional systems as an alternative to this majoritarian system. And we found that it has a number of advantages. So, on the one hand, representatives tend to better reflect the spectrum of citizen preferences. And this is because you can have multiple representatives in any given district. So, it's possible, right, that you will get these moderate candidates, but you can also get at least one candidate that's further to the left or further to the right, right on the edges of this political spectrum. So in the aggregate, we tend to have better representation. We also tend to have better representation of minorities, whether they're ideological minorities in the situation that we talked about before, or whether they're actually ethnic minorities, religious minorities, even gender minorities. So I showed you that chart that showed that there are more female parliamentarians under or female legislators under proportional representation systems than there are under majoritarian systems. But the disadvantages of a system like this are, one, the coalition government that is formed out of a proportional representation system might inaccurately reflect an individual's preference, right? So this largely happens because these systems tend to give outsized influence to minority or extreme parties. They can. I showed you a chart where um, radical right-wing parties tended to get more cabinet seats than their actual vote share would allot them. And so what that means is if we get these radical parties in important positions, the coalition government, that cabinet that is formed, might not reflect citizens' preferences, right? There are few voters who actually want these parties to be in power, and so they receive very few seats. But if they receive a very important cabinet position, that means they've got outsized influence that doesn't really reflect their actual popularity among citizens. And so we looked at this, kind of looking at an ideologically divided society, perhaps trying to figure out, okay, what's better for stability? What's better for representation? But now we're going to look at different forms of division. And the main question we're going to ask here is which electoral systems are better for divided societies, not only in an ideological sense, but perhaps in a religious sense and an ethnic sense. And why is that the case? So which electoral systems are better for divided societies? Well, the literature, I mean, this is still open for debate a bit, but the literature has largely come out on the side that majoritarian systems, these first past the post systems, these FPTPs, tend to be pretty catastrophic, particularly when we're talking about ethnic divisions, whereas PR is a much better system. Remember really quickly that, again, majoritarian electoral systems are the ones in which you can only have one representative per district. So one person gets to come out of an election as the winner. And the selection rule, as I said before, is a first past the post. And the post can differ depending on how many parties there are, et cetera. But there tends to be some type of plurality or majority rule in place. And so the disadvantages, the reasons why people think this isn't really good for ethnically divided societies should be pretty obvious to you at this point. One of the major disadvantages, right, is that it's a winner-take-all system, and that tends to increase, it decreases representation, but it also increases the stakes of an ethnic competition. So if in fact, let's say we have a perfectly divided society, 50% of our, okay, not perfectly divided, 49.9% of the population is African American, and 50.1% of the population is, I don't know, let's just pick a different, let's say is Japanese American. Don't know what society this is, but just for the like, just for the sake of a hypothetical, let's assume that this is a society. Well, so if we have this very divided society, and we assume that African Americans and Japanese Americans have different political preferences, right? They want different things. Then having the representative that comes out of this be Japanese American actually increases the stakes of competition between these two groups, right? Only Japanese Americans then will get their preferred policies in place. African Americans are basically shut out of the political system in that case. And so there's a lot more competition between these two groups because the stakes are so high, right? Either you're completely included or you're almost completely excluded from the political system. Another problem is that when societies are extremely divided, right, when we don't have an almost even division between two groups, then winners are not even going to really represent a majority of the population. And we can see this very clearly in cases like Kenya. So Kenya is a highly ethnically divided and fractionalized country. The major groups are the Kikuyu, the Kalenjin, the Luo, and the Luya. But none of these groups represent more than a quarter of the population. And so what we have seen in the past couple of elections is that Kikuyu members, Kikuyu president has arisen out of the electoral process, and a Kalenjin president has also arisen out of the electoral process in different elections. And so you can see that these don't represent majorities of the population, right? If Kikuyus only vote for other Kikuyus, then the president is basically voted in by a plurality of maybe 22% over 13, but that's not a very large share of the population. And so they, in systems like this, people who win elections have a very difficult time claiming the type of legitimacy that we typically assume a majoritarian representative would have, right? That they have the mandate of the majority of the people. This also has happened in Papua New Guinea. I believe in 15 uh, 15 different elections, parties were able to win with only about what, or rather, sorry, in several elections, parties were able to win with less than 15% of the vote. Over half of the legislature came in with less than 15% of the vote because the electoral system and the electoral map was so divided. Another problem that has been particularly salient in Kenya is that because of this kind of winner take all system, people might use violence as a way to effectively fix elections or gerrymander elections so that they can ensure the outcome of any given election in a region. So, in fact, what we see, again, going back to this ethnic map of Kenya, what we have seen is people use violence to make sure that these Kikuyu areas are entirely Kikuyu, such that any representative that comes out of that area will be Kikuyu. And the way that they do that in places that are split ethnically is they use pre-electoral violence and post-electoral violence. So they go around either threatening or doing actual physical harm to members of other ethnicities as a way of gerrymandering these districts to ensure that their chosen representative will be the one that comes out of the electoral process. And so this is very problematic, right, for politics in a divided society. This is not what we want. We don't want widespread violence. What we would rather have is peace and compromise, things like this. On the other hand, PR systems are largely seen as the better choice for divided societies. And there are several reasons for that. So quickly, let's recall that in a proportional electoral system, you have multi-member districts, so multiple people can be elected to represent one single electoral district. And the number of, and how these kind of seats within that district, the multiple seats are allotted, is in proportion to the number of votes that any one candidate or party receives. So if there are 10 seats available for one district and a representative or party receives 20% of the votes, then that representative or party is going to get generally is going to get two of those 10 seats. So the advantages of a system like this are that proportionality rules tend to diffuse ethnic competition. So where ethnic competition, the stakes are raised in a majoritarian system because you're either completely in or completely shut out. In a proportional system, that you don't have that real possibility, right? So if you have gotten enough of the vote, over whatever the electoral threshold is, they're typically low, somewhere around 10%, then you're going to get some share of power, right? You're going to have some representation in the political system. And so that tends to diffuse any competition that might exist between ethnic groups. Also, the idea that groups have to form coalitions, right? That a coalition government is going to come out of this fosters this idea that ethnic groups have to work together, that there has to be some type of cooperation and compromise between them, and tends to institutionalize that process. But the disadvantages of this system is that it does institutionalize ethnic differences, right? So it kind of encourages people, because they don't need large percentages of the vote, right? They only need to get enough to pass the threshold. If in fact the threshold is 10% of the vote, you know that your ethnic constituents, your co-ethnic constituents, are 15% of the vote. Say I'm running for president, I know that there are at least 15% African Americans in my district. All I have to do is appeal to those people. I don't have to appeal to any of the other people in my district. So I could offer policies that only affect African Americans, that only will improve the lives of African Americans. And so this institutionalizes voting based on ethnicity, and really kind of converts it into policy practice, right? That people will run on campaigns that are exclusive. People might try to enact policies that are exclusive when they get into office, and so ethnic differences tend to be embedded very closely in these types of systems if we don't watch out. And so one of the ways that people have tried to kind of take proportional representation to the next level to make sure that it creates this type of ethnic harmony that we're looking for is through a process called consociationalism. And the idea of consociational systems was really pushed forward by this guy, Arend Leipart. I think we've read some of his readings. The during week 9. And what consociationalism is basically a specific form of governance which tries to regulate kind of the sharing of power in diverse societies. And what it does is it creates power sharing among different ethnic groups by allocating those groups specific forms of representation within the political system. So it includes at least 4 parts. One, there has to be a proportional representation rule. So it's clearly embedded in the proportional system. There has to be some form of executive power sharing. So you can either have a coalition cabinet that is comprised of different representatives of different ethnic groups. You can have a multi-party cabinet. There has to be some type of veto power. So members of different ethnic groups can veto laws by one another. They have some mutual veto over one another. And then there has to be this thing called segmental autonomy. And this is the hardest one to kind of understand, or at least not it has the least intuitive title. But what segmental autonomy basically means is that ethnic groups have some autonomy in the running of their own affairs, typically at the civil level, and that community laws are often culturally based. So, if, for example, I am in a religiously divided society where there are Jews, Muslims, and Christians, if I am a Muslim woman seeking a divorce from my husband, I don't need to go to the state civil court to do that. I might be able to appeal to a Muslim religious court to be able to take on that process. And so where we see consociationalism, actually consociational systems exist throughout a lot of Europe, actually. So as Arend Leipart was studying consociationalism, he was using examples typically from Western Europe, so countries like Belgium, etc. But where I think the consociational experiment has the most to tell us about both the functioning of this system and the dysfunction of this system is probably in Lebanon. So Lebanon is a really interesting state. It was carved out of a number of different Ottoman republics that represented different religious groups. So Lebanon was originally a part of the kind of Ottoman territory of Syria, but Syria then itself was broken into different kind of districts representing religious groups. So there was kind of a Maronite Christian sector. There was a sector that was mostly Shia, sectors that were mostly Sunni. And when the French, once the Ottoman Empire was disbanded after World War I, and the French came in and took over that portion of the Ottoman Empire and divided up Syria and Lebanon into 2 different states, what we saw is that this multi-ethnic state develop that had all of these different religious groups in it. So the ethno-religious map of Lebanon is quite diverse. There are Sunni Muslims here indicated in green, kind of in the north of Syria. Most of this kind of middle portion of Syria is dominated by Maronite Christians. The area around Beirut is pretty diverse. There are Druze, Maronite Christians, Sunnis, Shias, and then here in the south we have a large Shia population, as well as here kind of in the central east. And so how did Lebanon tried to implement consociationalism. Well, of course, at first they had this proportional representation rule. So all of their Senate seats, which was their parliamentary chamber, were divided by sect according to a very specific formula that tried to make um, the number of seats that any religious sect could get proportional to its population in 1932 when the rule was started. So what we see here is the allocation of kind of ethnicities in Lebanon, and we see that their population, their share in the population tends to match their share in, or rather, their share in the Senate tends to match their share in the population. So Maronite Christians comprise about 29% of the population; they get 30.3% of the vote. Sunnis are about 20% of the population, so they get about 20% of the seats. Shias, again, around 20%, 22%, so they get 19% of the seats, and so on and so forth. So there was a real attempt to make the Senate representative of ethnic populations, almost in a one-to-one manner in 1932. The other thing is that executive power sharing was really a thing that they tried to do. So they made sure that there was always going to be a Maronite president, a Shia Speaker of the House, and a Sunni prime minister. So the executive was divided according to the three major sects. There was veto power instituted, so these different sects could have the power of mutual veto of one another if a law came to pass. And let's say Shias did not agree with that, they could strike it down. And then again, there was this segmental autonomy, such that things like the personal status code, which deals with divorces, deals with religious matters, deals with matters of dress, of custody, etc., were all delegated to individual communities and individual religious courts. So we had kind of this perfect consociational system implemented in Lebanon in the 1930s. Um, but the problem with consociationalism in Lebanon is that it didn't adapt very well to the changing demographics that we saw occur in Lebanon from 1932 to 1985. So they never changed the formula by which they would allocate these Senate seats. So the 1932 formula, right, where there's 30% of Maronites, 20% of Sunnis, 19% of Shias, etc., was still the rule in 1985 when the population had changed quite dramatically. In 1985, 41% of the population were Sunni. So Sunnis had really increased their share of the population. 27% were Shia. Maronites had actually fallen pretty low. They were only 16% of the population at the time. And so the system was now very unrepresentative, right? Because Maronite Christians were well overrepresented compared to Sunnis in the legislature, right? Sunnis had then a deficit of about 20%, whereas Maronite Christians had about 14% more seats than they should have. And what this led to, this kind of crisis of representation, led to a series of violent events in Lebanon over time, and eventually the outbreak of a very bloody civil war that opposed Maronite Christians, Sunni Muslims, and Shia Muslims, all kind of fighting in different areas. This ravaged the Lebanese territory, lasted for more than a decade. And so this kind of shows you how consociationalism can be dysfunctional and the negative places where it can end up when it fails, right? It can end in violence, it can end in civil war, and in massive casualties and deaths. So people have tried to think about how would we solve this, right? Clearly, if old consociationalism is not very flexible and can run into the problems of not being able to adapt to change very well, what do we do? And the reading that you should have done by Benjamin Riley proposes a new consociational solution to this through the use of a system that we already talked about, which is preferential voting. So recall from our last lecture that preferential voting is a system whereby you can actually rank order your candidates, right? So you're still only voting for a set number of candidates, but instead of having to pick one name or two names or however many names there are for seats, you can rank order all of the candidates that are on the ballot. And if no candidate receives enough first preferences to get a seat, then what happens is that we drop the candidate with the fewest first preferences, right? The person that people ranked first the least, and then their votes are then reallocated to other candidates until one obtains either a majority or enough votes to pass the bar. And remember, we saw a really cool video about how this is being done in San Francisco. It's also the system that they use in Australia very famously, but it's a system that we're seeing used in a lot of divided societies, Papua New Guinea being one, North Ireland being one, all of these which are talked about in your Riley reading. And the two ways that we see this implemented in a majoritarian system, so in places like Australia, we see the alternative vote being used, but in a proportional system, we see the single transferable vote being used. And so what I'm going to talk about is the single transferable vote, since most of the places where this is implemented is a proportional system. So the advantages of this are pretty, well, maybe they're not obvious, but they're pretty clear at the very least. So on the one hand, if candidates are, if constituents, so voters, are ranking their preferences, this gives an incentive for candidates to appeal to more than just their specific ethnic group. Remember, I said in proportional representation systems, one of the dangers is that if you have enough votes to kind of pass the bar, then you really only need to appeal to your specific ethnic group. But if you have a preferential voting system, you're not just trying to get people's first preference votes, you're not trying to just appeal to your ethnic group. You're also trying to get a lot of second choice votes and third choice votes, just in case you don't kind of get over the bar. You want to get those, and that can get you over. So candidates have an incentive to reach outside of their ethnic group to try to appeal to a broader electorate so that they can pick up more of those second and third choice votes. Voters are also incentivized to preference more moderate candidates. So instead of kind of going towards the extremes, right, that might be your first choice preference. But as you kind of go down your ranking, you're more likely to pick a candidate that's going to be in the middle, right? That's further away from your first preference, but still appeals to you in some way. And so it tends to draw the political system inward towards more moderate candidates. It tends to allow for easier coalition building. Again, it's bringing a lot of moderates into politics. And so groups have an easier time finding compromise with one another. And in fact, if candidates have already begun to appeal to the constituents of people from different ideological positions, people from different ethnic groups, candidates that arise from the system probably already have some basis for making a compromise, right? They've already considered what policy would look like if they had to not only just appeal to their own ethnic group, but to other ethnic groups. And so it's a lot easier to cooperate and build these types of coalitions. And so one place where we see this happening in action is in Northern Ireland. So Northern Ireland has a largely binary ethnic division between Protestants and Catholics. And the troubles that existed, or rather the divisions, you'll see why. If you know anything about the history of this, it's kind of a pun that I use the word troubles, but and I'll explain that in just a second. But anyway, the divisions between these groups were pretty stark, and led to a period of civil war for those of you who have watched movies about this, the IRA was a very big uh, terrorist group during this time, right? That enacted violence throughout this kind of civil war that Ireland was exposed to, and the times of all of this violence were called the Troubles, hence the pun. Um, so in this sense, Northern Ireland had very stark ethnic divisions between Protestants and Catholics that had already been mobilized into violence. And once an end to the violence was negotiated, um, people who were designing the new political system in Ireland had to think through, okay, how are we going to reconcile these differences? How are we going to make it such that we develop a political system that promotes compromise between these divided groups, that promotes stability and accurately represents different members of these ethnicities? And what they decided upon was a preferential voting system in which candidates would be rank ordered. Um, and so actually what we see is that a lot of this actually works, right? It works in the ways that we expect. So although so remember that in these these preferential systems, you vote for your first choice candidate, but if your first choice candidate doesn't make it past the bar in your district, then that vote gets reallocated to the candidates that you ranked either second or third, depending on how far we have to go down this system. And so what we see is that if we look at how votes were transferred, so if I voted for the DUP originally, where did my vote go to if my candidate didn't make it? What we see is that most vote transfers are actually inter-ethnic, right? So most vote transfers happen within one side of that ethnic divide. So people who vote for Catholic parties, their second choice votes are often Catholic parties. People who vote for what we call unionist parties, so the Protestant parties, are often still Protestant, but they do tend to transfer to more moderate groups. So people who voted for the DUP, which is the much more extreme group, their votes tended to transfer to the UUP, a much more moderate group. 39% of DUP votes in one district ended up going to the UUP. In another district, it's about 20%. And there's also some, and this happens also on the Catholic side, on the national side, right? So Sinn Féin was a very active and militant group that was connected to violence during the Troubles. So 68% of Sinn Féin votes, so when the Sinn Féin candidate did not make it, actually went to the more moderate party, the SDLP. So we see a lot of vote transfer going there. And the last thing is that we actually see some vote transfer going from not just within parties on either side of this ethnic divide, but from moderate Protestant parties to moderate Catholic-based parties. So in one district, 39% of UUP votes, so this is a moderate Protestant party, end up going to the moderate Catholic SDLP, right? So we do see a lot of the things that we were talking about before, right? We see that voters are tending to preference these more moderate candidates, and that we can actually see vote transfer from one side of the ethnic divide to another side of the ethnic divide. So let's just sum up what we've learned thus far. This is going to be the end of this lecture, so this is where you'd start shuffling your books. So proportional systems on the whole are typically better for divided societies than majoritarian systems. And this is largely what the discipline has come to. Some people do say that even in a majoritarian system, a preferential voting rule might ease some of the ethnic conflict, but in general, we want proportional representation systems because they diffuse ethnic competition, because they tend to increase representation across ethnic divides, and they promote the building of coalitions between different ethnic groups. Consociationalism is one way to solve this problem, right? Implementing specific power sharing strategies between groups. However, as the case of Lebanon shows us, they have to be flexible to demographic changes, to any political changes. Ethnicities can become salient, ethnic groups can grow in their population. They have to be able to adapt to all of that evolution. They have to allow voters to choose candidates um, that run on measures beyond ethnicity, right? So they have to provide incentives for voters and candidates to appeal to more than just ethnic categories. And they have to incentivize moderation. And this is why preferential systems tend to work so well, because they do all of these things, right? They do allow candidates to appeal beyond their specific ethnic group. They do incentivize a more moderate political strategy. And because it's just rank ordering, right, they're flexible to any changes that the voters may have in their preferences, in their ethnic identification, their demography, etc. Okay, so for next class, obviously I want you to do the readings. That's always the big admonishment that I give. Next class we'll be talking about civil society, and we'll still be touching on some of this ethnic conflict in the later lectures, but keep in mind that ethnicity is going to be a theme, so try to see the connections between these next couple of weeks, because it'll be very important for you in the class. It's nice to talk to you. Hope this recording actually works. See you next week. Bye.